from the Industrial Revolution to this digital age. The human race has progressed at an accelerating pace. But this progression has paid its price in terms of depletion of natural resources, increase in pollution, and global warming, which are serious challenges to our future. The dilemma of modernization at the cost of degradation can be answered by sustainable development. And nature is the best teacher when it comes to sustainability, since nature has mastered the art of sustainable progress over billions of years. Albert Einstein once said, "Look deep into nature and then you will understand everything better." The wings of a bird inspired the invention of aircrafts and flying. The features of a shark's skin led to the development of the bodysuit that swimmers use to reduce friction. Burdock burrs triggered the thought of the all-famous Velcro fastener. Further, water-repellent properties of the lotus leaf has inspired scientists to create new generation of paints, glasses, and fabrics which require less effort in cleaning. We have learned to build great architectural marvels from nature's simplest life forms and structures. The Beijing Olympic Stadium was inspired by the aesthetic design and sturdiness of a bird's nest. The structure, visible from the outside, mirrors the branches of the nests that work together to achieve unimaginable resistance to the elements. The ability of natural cooling and ventilation in many modern buildings is adapted from the art of cathedral termites that can build amazingly tough towers which are more than 15 feet high and have natural air conditioning systems. Suspension bridges and the engineering behind their design were adapted from the simple spider's web, which is lightweight yet creates very strong structures. Some of nature's smallest life forms have proven that size and shape is not often representative of strength. The weaver bird can be described as nature's architect. Its nest is of an astonishing design, strong, tough, and intricate. Honeybees are skillful design engineers of nature. Hives of worker bees are wonderfully light and strong, with uniform hexagonal cells that are used to store honey. The ant truly is nature's small wonder. Maybe strong wonder with unmatched strength. While it weighs around 3 to 5 milligrams, it can carry 10 to 50 times its body weight effortlessly. In the smallest forms of life live nature's greatest architects, engineers, and planners who design, build, and execute structures which are strong, lightweight, and enduring. Inspired by nature, Tata Steel is proud to present a high-strength variant of hollow sections. Tata Structura 355 for the first time in India. It has an enhanced yield strength of 355 MPa in line with international standards. The higher load carrying capacity will result in less steel usage by about 15% compared to products currently available. Thus, it will be very economical and will also reduce the environmental impact. Tata Structura will make the buildings greener and therefore play a vital role in sustainable construction. Tata Structura 355 can be used in airports, stadiums, metro rail projects, shopping malls, commercial buildings, and bridges, making it the strongest hollow steel section now available in India. Around the world, fire protection of steel structures is an important challenge. Tata Steel has successfully developed an economical and sustainable solution through innovation in metallurgy. The fire-resistant variant of Tata Structura 355 is capable of retaining 60% of its yield strength at 600 degrees centigrade for about 2 hours, thus ensuring fire-safe buildings and structures. Tata Structura 355 will now change your perception of designing, building and executing structures that will be strong, lightweight and enduring. Tata Structura 355, inspired by nature.
A very good evening to all of you to the first edition of the webinar series of Notions of India. I would want to welcome Mr. Praveen Srivastav, Chief of Marketing and Sales, Tubes SBU, to come forward and set the context. With over 20 years experience at Tata Steel, Praveen has excelled in multiple roles ranging from B2B and B2C sales, channel management, branding to international business. Presently, he is leading the commercial function of Tubes with focus on customer-centric initiatives while spearheading the revenues. Mr. Srivastav is a graduate of NIT Jamshedpur and completed his MBA from IIT, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. With sports enthusiast, Mr. Srivastav believes in maximizing productivity in every field. Over to you, Mr. Prabhu.
Good evening, everyone, or good evening, good morning, depending on wherever you are. First of all, thanks for joining this webinar. I know we are all passing through a difficult phase, and especially those who are in India on a late evening. I must thank all of you that you have taken time out to join with us today. First of all, I hope all of you are safe and you are joining this from the comfort and more importantly, safety of wherever you are. As the conventional wisdom says, please stay put safe, and that is most important for us. So that I want to convey that message of health to all of you, first of all. So currently, as I was introduced, I handle the tubes business. We make precision tubes for automotive. We make large dia tubes or pipes for conveyance. But most of the audience here must be familiar with the brand name Tata Structura, which is our Tata Structura is our hollow section, the brand name for hollow section steel that we supply for structural applications. It has applications as small as grill and gates in an individual house to large infrastructure projects like airports, metros, stadiums, etc. What we have done in our last decade and a half is, with the help of architects and structural engineers, many of you are here. We have introduced Tata Structura into many specification and projects, and today we see a lot of applications using Tata Structura in India. But while on this journey, we realized that India does not have too many modern structures or iconic structures, as many of the as you would see in many of the advanced or developed countries. India has only very historic monuments as iconic structures. And just to promote, and since we are from steel, to promote steel structures, we introduced this architectural competition about decade and a half back to invite architects to use steel and specifically hollow sections in steel structures. And subsequently, over the last decade or so, we have erected 3 of such winning entries as structures in 3 cities. Obviously, this is not enough. They are very small, and therefore we realize that we need to do this competition more frequently. And therefore, here we are once again with Notions of India 2.0. Again, where we are inviting architectural designs from all over the world for standalone steel structures. And this is not an academic competition. The winning entries, we intend and we will commission those winning entries structures at prominent places in prominent cities all over the country. The timing and theme of this competition coincides with the kickoff of 75th year of independence of India, and therefore the expectation, and we look forward for architectural designs which covers or which promotes India's culture, India's heritage, and not to mention India's future prospects as well. And as part of this Notions of India, we will be conducting a few such webinars where very prominent influencers all over the world will be joining us. We are happy to have Neil Leach today. And all these are part of this competition. So all the best to all of you. Can we have the video of Notions of India?
As we rev up to celebrate India's 75th anniversary of independence, to bring alive the legacy of Tata Steel, Tata Structura launches its initiative, Notions of India, a seminal competition to celebrate India's journey and Tata Structura's mission to give the shape of things to come. A shape that will capture India in all its diversity, its enigma, which powers its extraordinary capability to metamorphose as we steamroll into the future such that it can stand tall while meeting the aspirations of its people. Notions of India, a design competition that brings fruition to an idea. It is a quest for an iconic, timeless symbol using steel hollow sections that will amaze and inspire. This is a call-out to our engineers, our architects, designers who are not restricted by size, our nation builders who will shape the future of the nation. Who will it be? Who will give the shape of things to come?
So, hello everybody, a very warm welcome to all of you. As you know, we have launched this curated webinar series to inspire the best architects, engineers and innovators. I welcome all of you to the first in the series with a webinar focus on shaping the collective future. The speaker for today's webinar is architectural theorist, Mr. Neil Leach. Neil is an architect, curator and writer. He is currently the visiting professor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's also a professor at the European Graduate School, a Gao Feng, I hope I've got that right, professor at Tongji University, and an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California. He has earlier written and emphasized that a nation is a contextualized narration inscribed around certain objects, and this defines our belonging in the world. His most recent work has developed in the direction of materialism and computation. I'm delighted to see so many of you here connected today, and I hope that you enjoy today's session. Please feel free to ask questions during the course of this webinar. They will be compiled and answered post the presentation. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's good morning, I should say. I'm based in Venice Beach, California, where it's 7:15 in the morning, but it's great to be connecting with you guys in India, not least because my own father spent much of his, well, he spent some time in India when he was young. So today I wanted to try and combine, I guess, the two backgrounds that I have as an architectural theorist with my interest in progressive architectural design, especially in the use of technologies, and in particular artificial intelligence, which I think is having a kind of a huge impact on the professional discipline of architecture. So my title today is Hybrid Identities, Hybrid Design, and I want to try and tease out what I mean by that, how hybridity can be used as a way of understanding our own notion of identity, but also the way in which we operate in a world that's become increasingly kind of global. I want to start with an image that many of you might have seen in recent days, the funeral on Saturday of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh and the husband of the Queen. And much of this kind of pageantry will seem very familiar. The Windsor Castle in the background, the soldiers marching, and so on. What might seem less familiar is the Land Rover in which on which the coffin of Prince Philip is being carried. And he himself was responsible in part for designing this particular Land Rover to carry the hearse, to be operated as a hearse. And it's something because he was particularly interested because he had a deep fondness for the Land Rover as a vehicle itself. And that's something I think that he shares with many people from the UK. My father was in the military. I'm not, but he was in the military, and I was often taken around in Land Rovers. And here we have one of the great iconic British citizens, Paul McCartney from the Beatles, on the left-hand side with an early Land Rover, on the right-hand side later on in life. Maybe it's the same Land Rover. And I just want to stress really how important the Land Rover has been in many of our lives. But we all know now that Land Rover is part of the Tata organization. It is both something in which the British take great pride and also in which Indians take great pride. And it speaks of a new form of operation in which the notion of hybridity has become crucial. Another export, shall we say, of British culture has been cricket. We were actually the inventors of a number of games, golf, rugby, football, cricket, badminton, and so on. And we get regularly, having invented the game, we get beaten by other people. At rugby, we are always beaten by the New Zealanders. At football, by the Brazilians and the Germans. And it seems that in terms of cricket, despite the fact that we invented the game, we lost to India recently. And I want to point out is, in a way, what it means to have the game of cricket being such an important part of Indian culture. Just like the English language itself, it's become integral to everything. But this kind of process of kind of cultural hybridization operates both ways. My father spent some time as a young man in India, and he came back with the secrets of curry. He'd been taught to make 4 different types of curry and became very famous among his friends and neighbors making these curries. And he would go through a ritual, spending the morning elaborately putting together these different spices to make the paste, to make the curry, and so on. A few years later, my mother bought a book, Madhu Jaffrey's Indian cookery book, and found out that there weren't just 4 recipes, but you could make hundreds of different recipes. And rather than spending all morning preparing the curry paste, she would use ready-made pastes. So all of a sudden, this is the kind of the world in which we operate. And now in the UK, I actually use this paste a lot in my cooking. And Indian cooking, and particularly chicken tikka masala, has been an integral part of what it is to be British. In fact, chicken tikka masala is supposedly now the most popular dish, overtaking roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. The person who speaks most eloquently about this idea of hybridity, of hybrid cultures, is Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha is himself a kind of very much a hybrid. He is from India. He's Parsi, which means his ancestors came from Persia. And he moved first to the UK to take a PhD at the University of Oxford before moving to Harvard, where he's now a professor. And he was somebody that I have engaged with in terms of my work on understanding cultural politics and identity. One of the central questions, of course, to Homi Bhabha is the notion of how identities today are always contested, they're always fluid, they're always dynamic, they're always plural, and above all, they're always hybrid. And he talks about this in his book, The Location of Culture. He also speaks about how the nation, or the understanding of nationality, is itself can be understood as a form of narration, of telling stories. It's not just simply the objects, but the way in which those objects, those designs, those buildings, and so on, are inscribed within a national context. The way that they're given meaning by the kind of myths and stories that people tell about themselves. On the left-hand side is a book that was produced by one of my PhD students, Felipe Hernandez, who did a PhD on Homi Bhabha's work and tried to draw out his relevance for architecture. And this is a book that he published, Bhabha for Architects. I myself have spent some time looking at the question of how we can relate to Bhabha's thinking. I will simply show you this quote at the top here to show you that Bhabha's work is not so straightforward. It's quite impenetrable, some of his thinking, but nonetheless, the message itself is clear. When we're talking about cultural identity, we shouldn't be just talking about the object, about the building, about the design or whatever. We need to think about the subjective way in which that building, that edifice, that design is inscribed within the nation. The nation then, as he puts it, is a kind of narration. And these are my words here from my book, Camouflage. It is never an abstract narration, but a contextualized narration inscribed around certain objects. And it is precisely here within the field of objects which have themselves become the focus of narrative attention that we must locate architecture as a language of forms not embedded within, not only embedded within various cultural discourses, but also given meaning by those discourses. Now, I won't dwell too long on Homi Bhabha's thinking, interesting as it is, but what I would like to do, though, is to talk about how we might take this notion of hybridity and understand the way in which design works today. And I want to start by introducing another Indian, Shajay Bhushan, who has been a good friend of mine for some time. He is now, well, he has been for some time working for Zaha Hadid Architects in London, where he leads a group called Zaha Code, the computational research unit within the office. And he's become a highly significant player in that world. His brother Vishu has now joined him, and he's really a world leader. He came from India, he came to study at the Architectural Association in London, and then eventually became part of Zaha Hadid Architects, where he's been a central part to, in many ways, to the most progressive and interesting designs that have been going on around the world. And this particular project, the mathematical research exhibition in a museum in London, was the result of Shajay's own research work. But in all the work, from the early work from the Vitra Museum and so on, this computational group has had an incredible impact on the way that this is happening. But what makes this particular office so interesting is the fact that although it's located in London and has maybe 400 people working there at the moment, at one point anyway, there were only 6 people in the practice who were from the UK. It was a completely international a completely hybrid operation. And indeed, many of their buildings, and I'm showing you here some buildings now in China. This is the airport in Beijing, the largest airport in the world that was recently opened. Many of their buildings are across the world. It's in many ways a deterritorialized office. Although it operates from London, it is completely international, and its projects are completely international. And there are many Indian architects working for this practice. And all of this informed by an understanding of computation. And what I would stress above all else is I've come across so many Indians who are so good at computation. If you're in Silicon Valley, the dominant accent you'll hear is an Indian accent. And it's always struck me that India is, if it hasn't already, will have a huge role to play in the introduction of computation into the world of architecture. This is in Miami, a recently opened building by Zahedi Architects, to which I went to the opening. And one of my posts is actually at Florida International University. I'm no longer at USC. I'm at Florida International University and in Miami itself. And that idea of somehow of a decontextualized, deterritorialized form of operation goes also to the Architectural Association itself, a school of architecture that's been very influential in the history of architecture, and one where I taught for 4 years between 2000 and 2004, and continue to go back. It's almost like my spiritual home when I'm back in the UK. But what's interesting about this particular school of architecture is that in the 4 years in which I taught there, I didn't have a single British student in my classes. It was a completely international student. So very much like Zahedi Architects, we're talking about a culture that is global, in which a school of architecture is situated in London, and yet it is completely hybrid, embracing cultures from around the world. And what's interesting too about this particular building, in fact, the AA, the Architectural Association, is on the left-hand side here, is the way in which it's situated in a Regency Terrace in Bedford Square in London. The point being here that, echoing Homi Bhabha's theory about how we understand cultural identity, that the building itself was designed as a house, no doubt with the servants in the basement or in the attic and so on. But like many of the buildings in the square, it's changed its use. In fact, my publishers, Bloomsbury, who also publish Harry Potter, are also based in the same square, in a similar building. But the fact that in that particular building, the rituals of a school of architecture, the practices that go on there, the lectures, the seminars, the design studios, and so on, that's what makes it a school of architecture. In other words, there's nothing about the physical building itself that dictates it has to be a school of architecture. It's the way that it's inscribed within a narration, within a set of procedures and set of rituals, that makes it a school of architecture. So I want to move on now to look at the question of how we can take the question of hybridity and understand hybridity has been central to how we operate in the design school, in the design studio today. And what I want to introduce to you is a new strategy, a new technique, a new way of thinking that is becoming increasingly prominent. I've been working in this domain for 3 or 4 years now. I've just completed a book on this subject, and I'm about to embark on my second book. I have a series of seminars and lectures that I give on this subject. And the subject is artificial intelligence. What we're looking at here is what could be called a machine hallucination. It is something that is generated completely by the computer, and it's based on a data set of images of buildings by Zaha Hadid architects. And what is effectively happening is that it's hallucinating. It's hallucinating buildings that do not actually exist. And the technique for this, which is something called style GANs, I will explain in a moment. But more importantly, I want to point out that this is, I think, one of the most important new, fresh impulses in the design world of architecture. It is, as my colleague Matias Del Campo has put it, the first genuinely 21st century design technique in the field of architecture. Matias and I are going to be editing an issue of Architectural Design on AI and architecture in the next few years. And what's interesting about this is it can become a form of inspiration. It can become a kind of muse that can suggest possibilities out of images, thousands of images in this particular case, of buildings that have been designed by Zaha Hadid architects. This is taking a kind of latent spacewalk through those images and conjuring up other possible forms of building that are in a way interpolated from this data itself. And at certain key moments in this kind of this thing, you can identify a kind of clearly Zaha-like impulses that are kind of thrown up by the computer, images, forms never seen before, but which nonetheless have a kind of Zaha-like quality to them. And in a moment, you'll see emerging out of the computer screen a certain form that is quintessentially Zaha, that could only be designed by Zaha, but never has been designed. And there it is. This particular form, this particular form I've captured this and used it as my on the front cover of my book, Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence: An Introduction to AI for Architecture. This notion of hallucination, of hallucinating images, is actually very similar to the way that the mind itself operates. This is Anil Seth. Anil Seth has an Indian father who came to the UK, I think, in the 60s, married a British wife, quite unusual in those days. And Anil Seth has gone on to become one of the leading computational neuroscientists in the world. He's a professor at the University of Sussex, just outside Brighton, and where he leads a research unit looking at how you can use computational ideas to understand the way that the brain operates. This is his TED Talk. It has, since I took this photograph, it's had over 10 million hits. It's one of the most amazing TED Talks out there. And what he's trying to sort of say, which the title itself kind of is suggesting, is that we hallucinate our reality. The brain is in a form of bony skull. It's cut off from the outside world. It just receives a series of electrical impulses, and it is desperately trying to make sense of the world outside. It does that through what is called a form of hallucination. And this is the kind of theory that Anil Seth has, that if hallucination is a form of uncontrolled perception, perception itself is a form of controlled hallucination. It's not a question of what's out there, but we are simply making our best guess at what the world is out there. So, for example, if we were to look at a rainbow, in fact, a rainbow has been has got many different colors in it. It's got a whole entire spectrum of colors, but we are culturally conditioned to think about things in terms of the 7 colors of a rainbow. Ask any child around the world, I'm sure in India too, and they will draw these 7 colors in the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. The point being that we are trained very much like a neural network can be trained to see the world in certain ways. A number of artists have explored this way in which we are trained to see things in a way. This is the work of Memo Acton, where he's on the left-hand side playing around with a few objects on his desk. On the right-hand side, a neural network which has been trained to look and recognize, in this case, fire, but also flowers and also clouds and water, is interpreting that. And that's in many ways the way that we operate as human beings. We operate very similar to that in some senses. Oh, so I seem to have lost my presentation.
Yeah, Neil, could you open the presentation once more in your computer?
Okay. In fact, I think it might have crashed completely. What's this? Okay. Okay, here we go. Okay, I've got it back. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay. Oh, don't know. Sorry. Okay, let me try one more time. Can you see this again?
It's
Yes?
perfect.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. So this in many ways is manifesting how we are a bit like AI in some ways, that we see the world through the lens of things on which we've been trained. If we've been trained looking at fire, we can understand, interpret the image on the left as fire, or indeed as flowers. This was a project one of my students did, where replicating how we can understand that, how you can take parts of his wardrobe and on the left-hand side, a t-shirt, and the right-hand side, look at how a neural network trained on buildings designed by Zaha Hadid, actually a particular building in Saudi Arabia, how it will then begin to interpret the view on the left through that, in a way replicating the way in which we ourselves are trained to see the world in a certain way. So AI has become an area which is opening up not just design possibilities, but also to helping us to understand how we ourselves operate. Here is a tie, which is on the right-hand side, a neural network trained on images of downtown Miami, of standard tower blocks, and it reads the tie as though it's a tower block. This is completely fascinating material. It's opening up, in many ways, a new approach towards design in architecture. So I also want to kind of just explore exactly what is happening here and what is AI and why is it so relevant to, in my mind, to the future of architecture, to a future that's going to be highly computational, and to a future that I'm sure Indian architects will be playing a hugely important role. So the question I think that's often asked about AI is whether or not it can be creative. And most people think it's a machine, and machines can't be creative. Humans can be creative. Humans can imagine images that do not yet exist. Machines do not have dreams. This view by Makoto Watanabe, a Japanese computational architect, in many ways reflects the views that most people have about AI. You can feed it information, it can regurgitate information, but it can't do anything new. He himself actually is open to the possibility that in fact AI could do more than that. But let's just take this for the moment and explore to what extent AI could be able to hallucinate images. So this is a talk by Blaise Igueri-Iacos, who is from Google. He's in charge of a group called Google AMI, Google Artists and Machine Intelligence, where they're exploring the possibility of using AI to generate artwork. And I'll just simply go through one of the arguments he makes, pointing out how all of a sudden we're able to use computers not just to interpret things, not just to read things, but to actually to hallucinate things. So, and of course, we know how AI is able to recognize our friends on Facebook, on recognize images on Instagram and so on. And this is the standard procedure, whereby a picture on the left-hand side of a bird, this can be fed through a series of what are called neurons that are based on the neurons or inspired by the model, the neurons of the brain itself, a series of layers of these neurons connected by synapses that themselves are adjusted according to their weights in order to eventually give an interpretation that will tell you it's a bird. Now that's a fairly recent development, but it's fairly standard now. We can use AI to interpret things, to recognize things. Facial recognition, of course, is now become a central player in many ways. But what happens when we do the opposite way? So this is Blaise himself, and he then looks at how we can take the word bird on the right-hand side, and rather than going from left to right, to go from right to left, and look at how these things can eventually kind of begin to hallucinate what eventually will be a bird, an image of birds themselves. Somewhat chaotic. These birds are pose invariant, they're all over the page, but nonetheless, this opened up a whole field of operations whereby they could explore how we could hallucinate very curious objects in many cases. This is what's called deep dream, and this is a neural network clearly trained on dogs that's beginning to read dogs all over the place. Well, that was interesting in itself, and you can also use it to interpret paintings in a certain way. This is a photograph of Zaha Hadid, and you can use a filter to produce a Van Gogh version of this, a kind of version of style GANs, of style transfer. But the interesting thing happened in 2014 when this computer scientist, Ian Goodfellow, started exploring the possibility of how we could use computers two neural networks working together to produce images in a much more rigorous and precise way. And his notion really basically is that what happens, you have these two neural networks, one which is generating material, that neural network is called the artist or the generator, and one which is trying to judge whether it's convinced by those material or not, what's called a critic or a discriminator. And this is very similar to, let's say, in the art world, we have an art forgery. Are these paintings on the left Van Gogh or not? You ask an art critic, and the art critic tells you whether it's a genuine Van Gogh. So the way that it works in terms of the the process itself is you get on the left down here, you get some random noise coming into the generator, which is then producing some kind of image. That's one of the neural networks. This other neural network, known as a discriminator, is then trying to judge the image that's been produced against a training set of images, so presumably Van Gogh paintings, to try and understand whether this image is a convincing image or not, and it makes this judgment. Is it real or is it fake? A bit like the Turing test itself, which is designed to tell you to try and find out whether it's a computer that's doing this or not. And once it passes that test, then it produces something new. And this is one of the early examples of what has been used how this process has been used. So the process is called generative adversarial networks, where these two networks are competing against each other to produce these images. The short term for this is GANs, and these are some faces that have been completely hallucinated by the computer, by AI itself. And over the years, it began to get, well, not that many years, because it was only invented in 2014, but progressively, a series of other versions were produced to increasingly refine it. And this notion of hybridity, of course, is happening here. You have on the top here a series of sources that then, through source B, are interpreted. So this one and this one can produce this source and this source produce this, and so on. I'm not quite sure how this guy gets his beard, but anyway. And gradually, as they introduced a series of other ones, this is progressive GANs, and eventually they got to what's called style GANs, where they managed to disentangle these things so it became more and more precise and different levels of styles, as it were, until you get to the point where you can get the most astonishing images that are just simply hallucinated. Now, I should point out that these are all fake images, or fake people, as it were. They're not real people. But what this proves above all is that kind of comment earlier on I mentioned by Makoto Watanabe, that computers couldn't produce an image that something did not exist, has clearly been proved wrong. Computers are very good at producing these kind of things. In fact, you can go on, there's a site called This Person Does Not Exist, and I went to that site, and these are images that I generated on the computer based on that. AI, in other words, is extremely capable of producing unbelievably realistic faces. Well, that's all very well, but how does that apply to architecture? How do we engage with these techniques in architecture? The first area to be engaged with this was really the world of art, and art because it's two-dimensional, and started exploring this early on. In 2018, a painting that was generated by using AI was auctioned in Christie's, and it sold for almost $500,000. This was the first painting to be auctioned, and likewise, this image on the left-hand side, a painting by Mario Klingman, was the first painting generated by AI to be awarded international prize when it was awarded the Lumen Prize in 2018. The question is, who is the author? The controversy about this previous painting here was that the code had been produced by someone else, and then the group, the obvious who produced it, used that code and adapted it. So who is responsible? Here, Mario Klingman saying, well, if you hear someone playing the piano, is the piano the artist? No, it's the person controlling the AI. But anyway, and here he's been one of his experiments where he's uploaded thousands of images of paintings from the Renaissance, and then through a use of generative adversarial network, is hallucinating images continuously, different images the whole time. This is also a computer scientist who's learned how to use this process to generate artwork, to make art that is relatively convincingly similar to the canon, the genre that we know that is artwork. Also, NVIDIA produced something called GoGAN, where you, on the left-hand side, you can produce a sketch that then is interpreted through its neural network to make a highly realistic image of a landscape. So what happens in terms of architecture? The process that has been most popular has been GANs, but within GANs there's a particular kind of GANs called cycle GANs, which, like the concept of hybridity itself, is a way of combining two different data sets in order to hallucinate something that is completely new. Whereas style GANs works within a limited data set and therefore interpolates something that has to exist within that data set. Cycle GANs, by using two unpaired data sets of complete different material, can extrapolate, can produce something radically new. And what I'm showing you here is a study by Daniel Bolajan, one of the leading AI-based architects who use AI, where he's combining a video of a walk through a forest with photographs of the Sagrada Familia building in Barcelona, designed by Antoni Gaudi. And he's gone on to do many other things. This is Daniel Bolajan hallucinating buildings for Corp Himmelblau, a very progressive practice in Vienna and Austria, where Daniel himself has been working. And this was some of the early work that he was doing. What's interesting about these GANs, about deep learning in general, is that it develops over time and gets more and more refined. The more you use the network, the better the image that it's producing. So from this early kind of study, he was able to produce something much more refined. But this, which appeared about a year ago, was one of the most astonishing developments in terms of AI and architecture, the first time that we had kind of hallucinated an architectural landscape and used this technique to develop something genuinely new. The one shortcoming about this is the fact that although it seems to be three-dimensional, it is just a two-dimensional image, and moving into 3 dimensions is still a challenging area for the world of AI. Daniel has gone further to experiment with other things. This is actually the work of Corp Himmelblau again, but it's paired up with, it looks like a tornado, but certainly a storm. And what it's doing is comparing these two unpaired data sets and hallucinating, extrapolating a new vision of a new form of architecture. Perhaps the most refined one has been this one, which literally was released about 1 month ago, where again buildings by Corp Himmelblau are fed into a data set. Then in a process that involves both style GANs and cycle GANs, they begin to hallucinate new forms of buildings. These are buildings, in other words, which didn't exist before. They don't exist, and they are simply being hallucinated by the computer program itself. And this, for many people, is a really exciting development in terms of the new techniques available. Wolf Prix, who is the lead architect in Corp Himmelblau, was himself part of the decon movement back in the 1990s that reinvigorated architecture with a new way of thinking about things. And now he's exploring again the latest technologies to go and hallucinate, to produce a new form of architecture, to bring architecture alive in many ways with a new aesthetic impulse that is radically new, that has never been seen before. And just to remind you, the GANs were only invented in 2014, and its application in architecture probably goes back to about 2019. And this itself has come out is the most recent work that's appearing. And some of the work that comes out is actually very convincing. This is you can see by this is a very crisp image that's been emerged out of this particular kind of work. GANs are able to be used to produce an astonishing new forms of architecture. This, to my mind, is going to be absolutely central to the office of the future. What we're going to be finding is that these techniques will be more and more integrated into the office of the future. Just as we'll get self-driving cars becoming more and more common, so these techniques will be at the center of what it is to be an architect, hallucinating buildings in a way that has never been done before. This is the work of ex-Cool Wan Yu He, who is one of my doctoral students at Florida International University, and she's here hallucinating a series of modernist buildings in many ways, it depends on what data you put in. And in this case, the data that has been inputted is the data based on modernist architecture. If you put in data based on Zaha Hadid buildings, you will get Zaha Hadid buildings, and so on and so on. And this is the kind of thing that is being produced right now. It's not perfect. You can see that it's very imprecise. There are glitches in some of these images. But nonetheless, this is a starting point. And given the fact that technology is developing at an ever increasing rate, exponentially fast, we can assume that by the end of the decade, we'll be able to use AI to hallucinate a complete building with its complete details without needing to construct BIM models and so on by the end of the decade. And it's going to also be used to go and test out certain aspects of the building, to test out the way in which the performance of the building performs in terms of of environmental concerns and so on. This is a new way of operating that is becoming increasingly important in architectural circles. The reason why I think this is going to be the game changer is that increasingly clients are asking architects to use this software because they can guarantee return on investment. It's not just a tool for making sexy designs, for making innovative experimental designs. It's actually a practical way whereby you can maximize the profit from your site. And you can also intervene yourself, and this is a kind of hybrid thing whereby the human comes in and is part of the whole thing, and you can, so its AI becomes an extension of the human imagination, and this is referred to not as AI, but as either intelligence augmentation, IA, or extended intelligence. And that's the way in which it's being used at the moment. These are all produced with the use of AI. With my students, I've been exploring this for some time. One thing I will say, this is the AI generation. This is the generation that has AI apps on their phones, whose world in which they're kind of completely surrounded by AI, even though it's almost invisible. And this is the generation, of course, that will be at the peak of their careers by the time that AI really kicks in to the architectural environment. So these are some images that have been produced by my students at Florida International University. We did a workshop for 3 weeks with Daniel Bolajan, who taught them to use style GANs, cycle GANs, and pix-to-pix. And these are images that are being, as it were, hallucinated by the computer itself. This one of the Grand Canyon, images of a kind of grotto, a cave, a gorge in the Grand Canyon that is then hallucinating its own forms. Another one of my students, Christopher, produced this study based on the work of morphosis, the practice run by Tom Main, the Pritzker Prize winner in Los Angeles. And here you can see how the language of morphosis is clearly being kind of replicated in these novel forms that have been produced there. Another one of my students looked at the possibility of taking plans by Tom Main and feeding these through a neural network to produce further extrapolations. So these are based on a series of studies by the office itself. Initially, they used Grasshopper, which is a fairly straightforward tool in many ways, to take one particular design and do variations of it. They had 100 different sort of variations of that design. And then when you upload these 100 different designs onto the computer and feed them through, in this case, style GANs, you can get a series of other versions of those that have been generated automatically by the computer. Perhaps the misleading aspect of this is that you can see the heavy shadow lines that come from the initial model, which were themselves shadow lines, are really just patterns or splotches, as it were, on the screen. They don't necessarily mean that these are three-dimensional forms, and that, of course, as I mentioned before, is one of the challenges in terms of using AI. Another challenge is, how do you control this? How do you make it work? How do you make it more precise? One of the things I mentioned before, of course, is the fact that the longer you train it, the better it gets. So this is a second version where it's been allowed to train further, and it's got much more refined in terms of its images. This is still the early areas of development. It's the early days, but my I'm predicting that this is going to be the biggest game changer in terms of architectural culture in the next few years. This is another version of GAN, which called one of it is called Big GAN, and Big GAN works like with using natural language processing. You feed it words and it generates images. In this case, the words that have been fed are give me a gold room or room of gold, and what it's producing based on the data set that it has, it's producing these novel outcomes that are completely new. Another exercise was done. Give me a room with plants, and this is what the computer is hallucinating, is generating a series of interior views of, or a series of interiors full of plants. So what I would say is that my students, are not only in their design studio, but also in their theory seminars, are absolutely fascinated by this new horizon, this new world that's opening up. Looking at the possibility here is a study of Miami itself, and then this is feeding off some morphosis buildings again, and it's generating a novel hybrid entity that is kind of both and, that is producing these novel forms of architecture. But my students are not just doing this in their theory essays for my theory class. 90% of my students are working on AI. They are absolutely fascinated by this new horizon, and I'm convinced that it's going to be the game changer in terms of how we operate as architects. This one was done using the work of Korp Himmelblau, but again, a very similar sort of technique, whereby actually this is based on, would you believe it, on a suburban house. At some point, you'll notice that a suburban house emerges out of this, but it's a suburban house that is being contaminated, that has been through a kind of hybrid process that is producing something that is absolutely radically new, completely different. There we have the suburban house, completely different to anything we've seen before, opening up a field of possibilities and inspiring architects to produce new forms of architecture. This, I predict, it's already it's hitting certain schools of architecture, certain progressive schools of architecture, and it's going to spread everywhere. And I'm convinced that it's going to be spread to India, where a nation that is known for its computational expertise, it will be able to take this much further. So I also want to suggest that what we're trying to do in terms of our work is make all this available for people to go and see. If you look at this particular website, we have a series of tutorials by Daniel Bolajan, a series of seminars looking at the impact of AI on architectural design, involving people like Patrick Schumacher, who is the CEO of Zaha Hadid Architects, and Daniel Bolajan himself. Emmanuel Coe is another expert in this area who's just finished a PhD and who's now teaching in Singapore. And Matthias Del Campo is my colleague with who I'll be working on my on the AD on architectural design. I'm also part of a Digital Future organization where we had, last summer, we had a huge event called Digital Futures World. We have many thousand architects from India. We were collaborating with Sarita for Young India and helping to spread the word, a completely free series of talks. And we continued that. We continued over the course of the year, every Saturday, to have a series of seminars of panel discussions, and this was one based on Zaha Code, where Shajay Bhushan and Vishu Bhushan and Patrick Schumacher all took place. Our vision here is to try and to break through the walls of the classroom and to use a digital platform to spread ideas around the world, to spread ideas so that people in more remote places, in maybe less privileged economic communities, can nonetheless be accessible to ideas. Our view is that education should be a human right and not a privilege. It shouldn't be just for the rich, it should be for everyone. So we're trying to use this platform with our volunteers to spread ideas for free. And finally, I'd say that in a few weeks' time, we're going to be having another venture. We're calling this Inclusive Futures, where we're going to try and go even further to embrace more people around the world to try and open up these possibilities. The workshops that we've got, they start on the 26th of June and go on to the 3rd of July. After the competition, I understand, is finished, and they're free for Indians and free for anyone around the world to come and join in. And Zaha Hadid Architects will be part of this So I welcome you to be part of this particular event. We have a doctoral program first of all, followed by the workshops and followed by an international conference. All of this will be live streamed throughout the world. So it's a great pleasure to be able to present to you some of these ideas that are kind of shaping a collective future in which we are in many ways all dependent upon one another. We have our hybrid existences, and there are different forms of hybrid design which are in many ways changing the way in which we operate as architects. So I will I'll finish my presentation there, and I'm not quite sure how I see any of the questions, but let me just how do I escape here?
Neil, we are almost out of time. We could take a couple of questions.
Okay. Do I need to okay, I can't, shall I leave my screen like this?
Should I, yeah, you could stop sharing the screen.
How do I do that? Stop sharing. Oh, good. Right.
Yeah. The first question is, since AI is very capable of producing millions of iterations for drawings as well as visuals based on the site context and such parameters, how is the role of the architect different from a mere input agent of this data to AI, say 30 years down the line?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, I think the process itself has become different. When I was trained as an architect, it would be the architect sketching something out, and that's what would be the end. There would be a process. What tends to happen now is you use the computer to do a form of search. You establish certain kind of parameters or constraints, and then you unleash the algorithm and see the many outcomes that appear, and you then choose whatever you think is best. Often that's based on what looks the best, right? But it could be based on any number of different constraints. But it's a fundamental change, in a sense, from the previous model. It's not someone that you're totally in charge in a very top-down way, imposing form on the world. Rather, you are kind of opening up to a range of different options of possibilities. An AI can think of thousands and thousands. And then you select from that kind of menu of options. So it radically changes things. And I guess the point is, in 30 years' time, that's an interesting question, right? Because what you get is you increasingly want to get AI that's going to be capable of not only generating this, but also, as you have, let's say, with Spotify or with Amazon for books and things, it'll know your tastes. It will know exactly what you want, and very soon, I'm convinced that AI will be able to produce a building that will be entirely to your liking automatically. Now, what does that mean for the architect? That's a good question. But, there is this danger, I think, that if the self-driving car takes over, we don't need drivers. What happens to the architect in 30 years' time? To my mind, the important thing, though, is to be aware of this kind of issue and to be very quick to realign what it is to be an architect. So to my mind, the important architects will be the ones who will really benefit and survive in this culture, but the ones who understand AI and who can really make it work for the benefit of humanity. So my advice to all Indian architects is to really get involved in this technology, because it is going to be a game changer. And I would simply say that I've come across so many Indian architects, or even though in India there's not much computation in architectural circles, in the West, some of the leaders, not just Shajay Bhushan, not just Vishu Bhushan, but also Samir Kashyap, who used to work for Frank Gehry at Gehry Technologies, these are Indians who are part of this new revolution. And I've had discussions in the AA with various colleagues. Lars Hesselgren was telling me that he has a theory there's a whole tribe of Indians who are going to be computational experts, and he wants to find out who they are. So there's something that I always have a joke with Shajay. Why is it that Indians are so good at computation? That's one of the questions. The other question is, why isn't Indian architectural culture more in tune with computation, because Indians are so good at this? These are questions that I look forward to being answered. I've got every confidence that India is going to play a central role in the development of these technologies in architectural culture in the future.
Yeah, the next question is the role of structural engineers in the future of AI in engineering and design. Does it help being a structural engineer in developing these data sets?
There's several programs now which use AI, and not kind of advanced AI, but AI nonetheless, to generate structural forms. And there are a number of them out there. I know that Philippe Bloch has one called Rhino Vault. I know that Mike Shee in our MIT in Australia has a software called Amoeba that also is used as a kind of generative tool. And I know that Autodesk is developing a series of these tools as well. Actually, the interesting thing is that it doesn't necessarily help to be an engineer. What I noticed, and this is back in 2003 or 4, I organized a conference called Digital Tectonics, and that involved Cecil Bauman, who is, I think he's from Sri Lanka, but anyway, he's has been one of the leading engineers, computational engineers in the world. What his comment was, one of the comments that came out from that conference was that actually the difference between the architect and the engineer is beginning to disappear, because in the past, the architect could draw, could sketch in a beautiful way. Engineers didn't do so well. Meanwhile, architects were never very good at structures, whereas engineers were. Now, increasingly now, once you're getting AI that's generating buildings, you don't have to draw yourself. And increasingly, once you get sort of software systems that are able to generate structurally efficient buildings, then the architect is able to catch up with the engineer. So my view is actually the difference between the engineer and the architect will begin the difference will begin to disappear, and we're going to get one kind of hybrid professional who's working in many different sort of fields. And I would say that's true of technology as a whole. You're getting architects who are becoming experts in 3D printing. One of the issues of architectural design that I co-edited with Behnaz Farahi was an issue on what we call 3D printed body architecture. And we realized that many architects were designing things for the fashion catwalk in Paris, for fashion designers, and using those skills as architects and redeploying them in a different arena. So my view is actually we're going to be in a much more kind of fluid condition, whereby the notion of the architect gets more, begins to hybridize in many ways. What we do will be able to kind of expand into other areas. At the same time, of course, AI will be encroaching on our areas, so we're not safe at all. But it's a very exciting future, and I think the important thing is to be aware of it, to be prepared for this future, because change will happen. And as educators, I think we have a kind of moral obligation to inform our students of what appears to be the way things are going. And absolutely, it's absolutely 100% sure that AI is going to be part of our architectural future. And the sooner we get up to speed on that, the better. It's already there with self-driving cars. I'm sure it's already there in certain aspects of other aspects in which Tata is involved, not just cars themselves, and it's going to be central to architecture. So my view is come and join us, and come and join our tutorials and find out about this. It's an exciting new development, and it'd be great to involve as many Indian architects in this new venture in the future.
Okay, one more question is, how could we start exploring the field of AI for architecture? How do we go about it?
Well, I mean, so I did put up on I can't, there were some tutorials. Can you see this at all? I don't know.
Wait,
let me just, I think, show my screen. So yes, I would simply say that this is one of the sites at the bottom here. If you can do a screen capture, you might get it, where we have a number of seminars that go on about that. I invited a series of architects to these seminars. There's also in that same site a series of workshops. The 3 workshops that Daniel Bolajan taught on cycle GANs, style GANs, and Pix to Pix are in that same website. And then I would simply say that you can also find here, and if you look at Digital Futures World, there are a number of other panel discussions. There are no workshops as such, but we will have in the summer some workshops in Inclusive Futures. So, I mean, this is to our mind really important, where you can spread this message, where we can use this platform to get ideas out there. And one of the central things that we're doing with Digital Futures, and especially Inclusive Futures, is to do this, everything's for free. We're having workshops for free, so it doesn't matter whether you're the wealthiest architect in the world or not, you can still access this knowledge. And this is part of our our mission to try and spread educational ideas around the world, to break through the walls of the classroom and make these ideas available for all. So so I would encourage everyone. We haven't actually advertised this yet. In the next week, it'll be advertised, and I think it takes place after your competition. But I would suggest to everyone they try and join this. If they don't get into the workshops, then we will live stream everything, so everyone will be able to see precisely what's going on. So that's the message I put out there, that we're not keeping this secret. We're trying to spread the word and trying to make everything available for free. So come and join us. And it'll be, if you look at the Digital Futures website, so this will have at the bottom left here, you can see if you just Google Digital Futures World, you will find where this information can be will be put out. So it's a very exciting moment. We're expecting to have, we had 80 workshops last summer. We had 12,000 applications, and we want to make it larger. We want to work especially for Young India, with Sarita, to make this available for Indians especially. I think it'd be wonderful if as many of you, people listening as possible, could come and join us. It's a very exciting time in terms of what we're doing. So
yeah. One last question is,
okay.
Which software do you usually use for AI? Do you use software? Which one do you use?
Well, okay, so it's not so straightforward. Python is the one that is most universally used. You won't be able to kind of just use Rhino or all those standard ones. But there's a particular technique, and actually, although it can generate these things, hallucinate these images very quickly, it actually takes a long time to upload the data to make that a possibility. But that's too long a question to answer here. But it's not just using Rhino or Maya or the standard techniques. But Python is a central software that's been used by most of these issues. But there's I would encourage the students to go and follow these tutorials and see what they can do. But I look forward to seeing some amazing work coming out of India. Yes.
Yeah, we'll take this last question.
Yeah, sure.
Are the models which are generated by AI, do they adhere to various structural codes and standards?
That's a very good question. Actually, I'm not sure the answer. I mean, what I was showing you, first of all, much of what I was showing you was what's called GANs, Generative Adversarial Network, style GANs and cycle GANs, and that's just two-dimensional. It's not even a three-dimensional model of things, and it has no structural integrity at the moment. But there is another area which has been developed, which I mentioned before. Amoeba, Rhino Vault, and so on. These are structurally, they're software developed by engineers. Rhino Vault is developed by Philipp Bloch, who is a professor at ETH Zurich, and Amoeba is a software that's developed by Mike Shih, XIE, who is a professor at RMIT in Australia. Whether they conform to codes or not, I don't know, but I'm sure they soon will be. So absolutely. I mean, I think more and more. I mean, just to say one thing is that this software is, or some of this software is capable of producing things that are much more efficient than anything we could think of. AI is able to think of possibilities beyond the range of what we could imagine, and this is what's revolutionizing things. So and that's like precisely, just to go back to my point I made earlier before. It's not the kind of the experimental forms, the kind of things that I was showing my students do. That's not going to be the game changer. The game changer is going to be when clients start insisting that their architects and engineers use this software in order to guarantee return on investment, in order to make sure they make the maximum out of their profit from their site, and that their buildings are performing as efficiently as possible. Now, that's already happening. It's already happening. And that's my prediction. Very soon, architects will be forced to use AI because the clients will insist. They'll say, I want you to use this to make sure that I guarantee my return on investment. So things are happening very quickly. There's a theory called Moore's law, which is to say that things grow exponentially. Things go down in half in price and double in their capacity every year, and that means that we have exponential growth. So the speed at which things are happening is really quite remarkable. The fact that Tesla developed it upgraded the software so you had a self-driving car just a few months ago, and I'm sure that Tata is doing exactly the same. I'm absolutely convinced that you guys are. It's central. Now, I'm convinced also that AI is already everywhere in the Tata Land Rovers and Jaguars. I mean, we might not see it there, but it's what tells us when we're straying out of lane on the motorway or something. There are lots of different ways in which AI is embedded in everything. In our phones, these iPhones are absolutely jam-packed with AI. It is the future. In fact, it's not even the future, it's the present. The problem for architecture is we're still way behind, but it will be essential part of what it is to be architect over the next few years. And my prediction in my book is simply in 10 years' time, or by 2030, we will be able to use AI to produce a complete building. And Wan Yu He, whose work I showed earlier on, she's developing in China some software under the name XCool, XKOOL, and they're already producing something that's going to bypass BIM. So all the building information modeling that's been central to that, they have a system called ABC, and there's a lecture about that on the site I gave you, that is revolutionizing the way in which we do buildings. And we won't be doing BIM models in the future. We'll be doing these kind of fully integrated systems that can automatically generate building designs. So it's maybe both exciting and terrifying at the same time, I should say.
Yes, I think we should close this session right now because it's already 15 minutes past time. Okay, Neil, thanks a lot. It was wonderful to see all your insights and the future of architecture here. And I hope that we have lots of questions, but unfortunately we can't answer all the questions in this session. But please do write to us, everyone, and we'll try our best to answer as many as possible.
And it'd be great if we can work for Young India to try and bring as many of these ideas to the students of architecture in India. I would love to involve them as many in the festival of workshops over the summer, this free festival. It'd be great to have as many Indian students there as possible.
Yes. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, you're a wonderful audience. And thank you, Neil, once more. I know it's very early in the morning and you took out the time. It's wonderful to have you for the Indian audience. Okay.
It's great to be here. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.